Picture three things happening on the same day. U.S. Navy and Army transport ships anchored at Subic Bay in the Philippines in an unusual pattern at a facility that America has not officially used in over 30 years. At Scarborough Shoal, a piece of water that China has aggressively guarded for over a decade, Chinese patrol vessels went unusually quiet. And a Vietnamese armed vessel was tracked near Fiery Cross Reef, China's most fortified military installation in the South China Sea. Read any one of those stories alone, and it looks like a routine maritime update. But read all three together, and something much bigger comes into focus. This was not three separate events. This was one moment. And that moment is telling us something important about who actually holds leverage in the South China Sea right now. Start with Subic Bay, because it is the anchor of this whole story. For most of the Cold War, Subic Bay was the largest American naval base in all of Asia. Ships were repaired there. Sailors were stationed there. It was the hub of U.S. power projection across the entire Pacific. Then, in 1992, the U.S. left. The Philippine Senate voted not to renew the base agreement, and after 100 years of American presence, the flag came down. Subic Bay became a commercial port, a free port zone. History, or so it seemed. In March 2026, U.S. Army soldiers from the 25th Infantry Division and local partners were photographed offloading trucks and helicopters from a military sealift command vessel directly onto the docks at Subic Bay. The equipment went straight into Agila Subic, a 300-hectare complex owned by an American investment firm called Cerberus Capital Management, sitting right across the bay. This was not a routine port call. The Army contracted private security to guard what its own documents called, and this is a direct quote from official contract records, sensitive military assets expected to remain staged at Subic between 2026 and 2027. At the same time, the Marine Corps quietly leased a 57,000-square-foot warehouse at the former Naval Supply Depot. The U.S. Navy issued solicitation documents for a climate-controlled facility near Subic large enough to make it, if built, the biggest American prepositioning site anywhere in the Pacific since the Cold War. Bigger than the Marine Corps' largest stockpile in Norway. Let that land for a second. Here is the thing most people get wrong when they see transport ships. They look for the missiles. They look for the destroyers and the carrier strike groups. That is what war looks like on television. But before any of that can happen, before a single fighter jet launches or a single Marine unit deploys, you need supply chains. You need fuel, spare parts, ammunition, vehicles, maintenance equipment. You need somewhere to offload all of it, stage it, and move it forward quickly. That is what transport ships and logistics warehouses actually mean. They do not signal a fight that is starting. They signal the capacity to sustain a fight if one comes.
Everybody works together to get, the mission accomplished, and that mission was to show that we're capable of, offloading gear and equipment, rolling stock from ship onto shore.
Scarborough Shoal, the contested feature that China has controlled since 2012, sits just 30 nautical miles from Subic Bay. That is not an accident of geography. That is the entire point. Now here is where the story gets interesting, because the most important thing that happened at Scarborough Shoal during this period was not what China did. It was what China stopped doing. To understand why that matters, you need to know what Scarborough has looked like for the past year. In May 2026, AFP monitoring confirmed 36 Chinese vessels, 19 of them near Scarborough Shoal alone, operating across 4 key West Philippine Sea features in a single week. In the first week of January, there were 41 Chinese ships and boats across those same 4 features. The Philippine Navy described the trend clearly: increased presence from the China Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Maritime Militia. In April 2026, satellite imagery showed China had installed a 352-meter floating barrier across the lagoon entrance at Scarborough. 6 Maritime Militia vessels were inside the lagoon, 3 more blocking the entrance from outside, and a naval or Coast Guard ship was parked just beyond. Filipino fishermen, whose families have fished those waters for generations, could not get through. This was the pattern: aggressive, persistent, grinding, water cannons, barriers, blocking maneuvers. China's Coast Guard even collided with China's Navy destroyer while chasing a Philippine vessel in August 2025, and still the pressure continued. Then, in late May, something shifted. From May 26 to 30, a U.S. Coast Guard cutter joined the Philippine Navy frigate Burp Antonio Luna and a Philippine Coast Guard vessel for a maritime patrol that brought them within 35 to 40 nautical miles of Scarborough Shoal. It was the first time a U.S. Coast Guard ship had ever joined Philippine forces for this kind of cooperative patrol at that proximity to the shoal. This is also the same period in which the Philippine Defense Secretary publicly confirmed at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore that the Philippines had received again. His words, raw information indicating that China may have already begun placing structures at Scarborough.
South China Sea activities, sea encounters. Once again, we are smaller countries. It would be foolhardy for us to initiate encounters, particularly in areas where we know, because we resort to legal means, we have no right to be in. Unfortunately, once again, the encounters are caused by an occupant without any right.
The same feature. The feature China declared a national nature reserve last year, a designation that every analyst watching the South China Sea recognized as the same legal groundwork Beijing used before turning submerged reefs into military islands. China looked at all of this: the U.S. logistics buildup at Subic, the U.S. Coast Guard patrolling near its contested shoal, the international spotlight at Shangri-La, and its patrol vessels went quiet. Beijing does not retreat without calculation. It never has, buying time and goodwill while quietly moving ahead with construction, or a tactical pause ahead of a different move. The Philippine military noted it plainly. After the U.S. Philippine patrol concluded, the China Southern Theater Command announced it had held combat readiness exercises around Scarborough. The app checked the data and said there was no evidence of any synchronized exercise taking place. The announcement was the message, not the activity. The absence of China's Coast Guard in that window is not reassurance. It is a chess move. Now bring in the third piece of this puzzle: Fiery Cross Reef. China built it, dredged it up from a submerged rock, paved a 3,000-meter runway on it, installed anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile batteries, underground storage tunnels, hangars capable of sheltering 24 aircraft, radar systems, and a deep-water naval harbor. Vietnam claims it. Vietnam calls it theft. Vietnam has never forgotten that the last time its forces confronted China near Fiery Cross, at Johnson South Reef in 1988, 64 Vietnamese sailors were killed. So when Vietnam sends an armed vessel near Fiery Cross, it is not reckless. Vietnam is one of the most careful players in this sea. Hanoi does not do proximity operations near China's premier military installation out of impulse. It does them when the environment feels right. And the environment right now is quite different from what it was even a year ago. By August 2025, Vietnam had completed land reclamation on all 21 of its occupied outposts in the Spratly Islands. It built a new runway on Barkay Canada Reef long enough for military aircraft to land. It constructed 8 new harbors across the island chain. The CSIS Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative noted that Vietnam had created about 70% as much artificial land in the Spratlys as China, and was on pace to match or surpass it. An expert at Honolulu's Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies put it clearly: the South China Sea is, in his words, an existential issue for Vietnam. 90% of Vietnam's exports to the world travel through these waters. Vietnam is not a bystander in this sea. It is a claimant that has been quietly building its position for years, and it moves when it senses the moment is right. A Vietnamese armed vessel near Fiery Cross Reef, in the same window that American logistics are massing at Subic Bay and Chinese Coast Guard vessels are pausing at Scarborough, is not coincidence. It is timing. Hanoi looked at the strategic picture and decided this was a moment to remind Beijing that Vietnam is present, watching, and not intimidated. Step back and look at all three together. American logistics depth at Subic Bay, Chinese patrol activity pausing at Scarborough, Vietnamese proximity operations near Fiery Cross. Three separate governments, three separate decisions, made without coordination, but all three reading the same shift and all three moving accordingly. That is what a real power shift looks like. Not a battle, not a treaty, not a summit, just behavior changing. Because behavior always follows capability. There is an important context here that is easy to miss. The Iran war pulled a U.S. carrier strike group away from the South China Sea. For a period, Beijing had more room to maneuver. China's militia fleet hit a record daily average of 241 boats operating in the South China Sea in 2025. The Chinese military declared a nature reserve at Scarborough, installed barriers, and escalated its Coast Guard operations. It looked, for a moment, like the space for challengers was shrinking. Then America moved differently. Not with a carrier, with transport ships, with warehouses, with a 10-year lease on facilities that the Navy's own documents say it will use through 2036. This is staying power. And staying power changes the calculation in ways that a carrier visit simply cannot. A carrier strike group passes through. Staying power is still there when the carrier is gone. Here is the question that nobody can answer with certainty yet, and it is the most important one. Is this the beginning of a new strategic baseline in the South China Sea? Or was this a single convergence, a rare alignment of events that will fade once the exercises end and the logistics cycle rotates home? The honest answer is, we do not know yet. History suggests caution. China has shown a consistent pattern in this sea. It retreats tactically. It watches the pressure ease. And then it advances again, quietly, incrementally, in ways that are hard to call out without looking like the aggressor. Every barrier removed has eventually been replaced. Every diplomatic pause has been followed by a new move. And China is not standing still. Satellite imagery from early 2026 shows that while American attention was partly drawn to the Middle East, China was still dredging, still building, still strengthening its presence across the Spratlys and Paracels. U.S. reconnaissance flights over the South China Sea dropped from 102 in January 2026 to 72 in February, a sharp fall that analysts linked directly to the demands of the Iran war. Beijing noticed that gap. Beijing always notices those gaps. But here is the other side of that argument. The warehouses at Agila Subic are real. The contracts run through 2027 with plans for a longer-term handover to the Army Sustainment Command. The Marine Corps Prepositioning Plan is a multi-year program. The U.S. Navy is seeking a 10-year lease on a facility near Subic, larger than any American prepositioning stockpile in Europe. These are not things that pack up and sail away after an exercise concludes. They are infrastructure. And infrastructure, once built, reshapes the strategic landscape on a timeline that is much longer than any single deployment cycle. The American footprint at Subic Bay is not a visit, it is a return. The South China Sea has not changed hands. China still controls Scarborough Shoal. China still controls Fiery Cross. The 9-dash line is still on Beijing's maps, and China will not take it off. But for this moment, all three claimants read the same shift in the balance, and all three adjusted their behavior accordingly. That matters. Not because it resolved anything, but because it revealed something real about how power actually works in this region. It does not work through declarations. It works through logistics ships, anchoring in a bay 30 miles from the most contested shoal in Asia. It works through warehouses full of vehicles and equipment secured under armed guard. It works through a Vietnamese armed vessel choosing this particular week to sail near China's most fortified reef. The South China Sea does not announce its turning points. They happen quietly, in satellite imagery and shipping manifests and contract documents. And then, one day, You look at the map and something has shifted. If that kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribe to Indo-Pacific Report. We cover the moves that happen before the headlines do.